So last week, we went by Kiwi's and took a look at his 392 Hemi, which we will be building on this channel sometime in the spring. But we took a look at his engine and we reviewed the history of the Chrysler Firepower, the 331, 354, and 392. And that's the engine that most people think of when they think early Hemi. But there were two other series. You had the DeSoto Firedome and the Dodge Red Ram. And each of these engines, along with their polyspherical cousins, because there's a whole series of other engines that need to be, well, each of these motors, they're installed an HVAC unit in the back, so that's the noise back there. Each of these engine series deserves its own video. And this time around, I want to talk about the DeSoto. And the DeSoto, surprisingly enough, after I explain it to you, you'll understand. The DeSoto, I consider to be probably the most significant engine in Chrysler history, or at least the most significant V8 in Chrysler history. It'll make sense in a few minutes. So here's how this worked. Chrysler introduced the Firepower in 1951 as a 331. The following year, DeSoto got its V8. It was the first V8 in a DeSoto line, and that was the Firedome. So now the distinguishing feature between the Chrysler Hemi and the DeSoto Firedome was their physical size. The Firedome is 2 inches smaller in every dimension than the 331, the Firepower Hemi. Same thing with the Dodge Red Ram. The Dodge Red Ram is 2 inches smaller in every dimension than a DeSoto. It's like a little jewel. And I'm going to talk about the Red Ram in the next video. But the DeSoto, introduced in 1952, is a small engine. Remember, this wasn't a cubic inch race at this time. They were just looking for efficient engines. It wasn't a high performance engine per se, the way we think of high performance engines today. So it was introduced at the 276 cubic inch size in 1952. I think it was rated at like 180 horsepower. It was a 2-barrel engine. The 7-to-1 compression. Nothing to get really crazy about, except for the basic architecture of the engine. So it's identical in just about every way to the Chrysler Firepower. Combustion chambers are the same but smaller. The block is the same but smaller. Everything is the same but smaller. They increased the deck height on the engine in 1956. And they brought it up to 330 cubic inches. It was with a longer stroke. And then they increased the stroke again. Oh, I'm sorry, no, they increased the bore for a 341 cubic inch engine. Now there was a 345, but the 345 was actually just a dual quad version of the 341. Not really important for what we're talking about right now. So the thing about the DeSoto and what makes that engine relevant, and actually in and of itself, it could still be a relevant engine today. They were incredibly overbuilt, beautiful forged steel cranks. The block castings were very high quality material and strong. The same thing with the cylinder heads, the rocker gear, everything is very, like all Chrysler engines of that era, it's overbuilt. The metallurgy, the design, it's all just beautiful. You actually have to handle these engines and their parts to appreciate them. So the reason I say the DeSoto is the most significant engine in Chrysler history is that its basic design, or I should say its basic form, morphed over the years. See, the Chrysler 331 through 392, the Firepowers, kind of dead-ended. They start in 1951, and then once you get past 1958, it's dead. And it's the same thing with the Dodges, the Dodge Red Rams. They were introduced in 53, and they were done by 58. Nothing to carry on. But the DeSoto formed the basis for the Plymouth Poly. See, while Chrysler had Hemis and Polys, and back then they didn't call them Hemis and Polys, they called them double rocket shaft and single rocket shaft engine. The Chrysler Poly was called the Spitfire. So it's basically the same block as a Hemi, but with polyspherical combustion chambers and one rocket shaft. Same thing with the Dodge. The Dodge Red Ram also had a polysphere. But the DeSoto, in the DeSoto line, didn't have a polysphere equivalent. Plymouth didn't have a V8 at all until 1955. Now, what they did with Plymouth is that they took what would have been the DeSoto Poly and turned that into the Plymouth V8. So, if you were to take an A motor, a Plymouth Poly, which was the original A motor, and put it next to a DeSoto, you would see that the blocks are almost completely identical on the outside as far as dimensions go. The bolt pattern on the back of the block is the same. The bore spacing is the same. The motor mounts are the same. They take the same timing cover. They take the same distributor. You drop it right in. If you took an oil pan off of an A motor or an LA motor or a Magnum and put it against the oil pan rail of a DeSoto Hemi block, you would see that the back 6 or 8 bolts on each side of the oil pan line up perfectly. They've made just a few differences and to the basic DeSoto design, and the Plymouth A motor was born, the Polyhead A motor. Now that engine, the Plymouth Polyhead, continued through the late 50s into the early 60s. And then in 1964, they added the wedge heads and created the A motor that we know today in the 273. And of course, naturally, the A motor became the LA motor became the Magnum, and so you get the idea. That original DeSoto block, the original dimensions and the original intent of that DeSoto block is the one that carried through the 50s in the form of a polyhead, which later turned into the wedge end. Okay, so you get the idea. This is why I consider it to be the most significant engine of that series. It didn't dead end, its genes lived on, and in some ways still do today. But let's get back to the DeSoto motor. It's got potential. The engines have decent sized valves, decent sized ports. There's a lot of potential there in the cylinder heads. The blocks are strong, the cranks are strong, the rods are strong. Pistons, you can get pistons. The biggest problem you have with DeSotos are camshafts. Anybody who tries to build a DeSoto has a big problem with camshafts, because one of the things that they did when they raised the deck is they changed the bank angle on the lifters. It starts off at a weird bank angle and it becomes an even weirder bank angle. It's the kind of thing that drives cam grinders crazy. So it's a low production engine, or I should say it's a low interest engine in the current world of high performance cars. So cam grinders aren't going to have blanks for this thing, on the shelf. You've got to start with a core, and the cores are not interchangeable between the low deck and the tall deck. It's not like you can take the cam out of a 383 and put it in a 440. It doesn't work like that with the DeSoto. The low deck engine has one bank angle, the tall deck engine has another bank angle. So they're not interchangeable. If you're going to build a DeSoto, you have to get the cam that came with that, or that style of cam. If you're building a 276 or a 291, it's got to be a low deck cam, and vice versa. Same thing for the 12 deck motor. From a factory high performance standpoint, they were okay. They were like par for the course in their day. But again, you see, nothing was really up to snuff. The performance, the numbers that we look at today, the type of performance that we deal with today is completely different than when they had in the 50s. At the end, they ended up with 340 some odd horsepower in a dual quad version that was available in a 1957 Adventurer. And that's it. But the vast majority of DeSoto engines with 2 barrels, you could still find them. They're around. And because they had that Hemi novelty all through the 60s and the 70s, people would come across them in junkyards and save them. So basic cores are around, and they're cheap. You can usually pick one up for under $1,000, like a complete motor. It's a good foundation to build with. Any place that an A motor will fit or a small block will fit, literally, the block's exactly the same size, all of the mounting is the same. Any place a small block fits, a DeSoto Hemi will fit. And it's actually easier to run exhaust on those engines, like if you had to build your own headers, because the exhaust comes down. Instead of coming out and down like it does on a wedge engine, the Hemis have the exhaust coming down originally. So, as part of their integral design. So it's easy to build an exhaust for a DeSoto, or actually any of those early Hemis, to fit in a later model car. But as far as like motor mount ears and everything else, exactly the same as a small block. You do need a spacer between the block and a modern transmission because of that extended crank flange, which is the same as a Chrysler. It's like a 1 inch further extended than the modern, the 1962 and newer transmissions. So you do need a spacer to make up for that. But the bolt pattern is the same as a small block. The bolt pattern is the same as a Gen 3 Hemi. So there's a lineage that goes back, really. There's so much from that DeSoto that lived on literally until the modern era, until like this year. It was the pivotal engine. So the DeSoto was really the first of the Hemis to go. The Chrysler hung out until 1958. The Dodge hung out until 1958. But the DeSoto was dead-ended in 1957. That was with that 341-inch motor and the 345, version of it. And it was replaced with the wedge motor. The first application for the B motor was actually in a DeSoto in 1958. So the B engine took the place of the DeSoto Hemi. But like I says, it's what would have been its polyhead equivalent lived on in the Plymouth and then evolved into the later engines. I can't really think of anything else off the top of my head. As soon as I'm done finished shooting this video, 10 other things are going to pop into my head and say, well, why didn't I talk about that? When I do the one on the Dodge Red Rams, we'll go back and cover anything I missed on this one. So, as I said, the DeSoto Hemi, they're beautiful. They're jewels. If you want to see the most beautiful engine you can imagine, go to Hotheads. By the way, the Hotheads, they're a place in North Carolina that specializes in early Hemis, and they are the go-to source for Chrysler, DeSoto, or Dodge Red Ram stuff. And I'm not advertised at all. I don't deal with them. I'm just telling you, that's really the only place to go. They have a pretty extensive line of parts for those engines. But you would be amazed how many LA parts interchange directly into the DeSoto engine. All right, I have to keep painting. I'll see you tomorrow. Yeah, I knew it. As soon as I stopped filming that, I realized I wanted to talk about the performance potential of an engine in today's world. So to give an idea of what those things are capable of, you have to go back to 1970 and the junior fuel class, which were unblown dragsters. They were in these things mostly out in California. They were unblown dragsters limited to 305 cubic inches, and they could just run all the nitro they needed to. And the team of Adam and Enriquez, Gene Adams and Don Enriquez, had a 276, a low-deck DeSoto motor, and for a while they owned Junior Fuel, and that thing was regularly over 200 miles an hour. Now those engines back in those days, very, very unsophisticated. They were literally taking engines out of the junkyard, just put a set of pistons in it, cam, intake, the fuel injection intake, and sending them on the can. So you're talking about a motor that was capable of running 200 miles an hour way back in 1970 without a blower, and those engines were stock crank, stock rod, stock valve train, and they lived. They actually hung in there. So I wanted to throw that in there, just to give you an idea what these engines are actually capable of. If they could make that 1,500 horsepower back then with stock parts, they can still do it today. Tons and tons of potential built into those engines. By the way, Don Enriquez these days works for Holley. He's only about 100 miles up the road over here in Bowling Green. So if you really, really want to know about the DeSoto stuff, it may pay to track him down and maybe pick his brain a little bit, because he'll know a lot more about these engines than I do. I don't know if he wants to be bothered with it. I don't know. Message him and find out. Okay, that's it. I'll see you tomorrow.